"Don't let him get near her," someone shouted, their voice echoing across the concrete corridor just as the massive figure slammed against the steel barrier again, the sound ringing sharp and hollow like a warning no one could ignore. And in that moment, every pair of eyes inside the enclosure was locked on the same terrifying possibility, because on the other side, barely moving, lay Luna, the albino gorilla who had not stood up in nearly 3 days. The security camera above flickered slightly as Marcus, a silverback long, forgotten in the far end of the facility, paced back and forth with growing urgency, his heavy breaths fogging the glass, as if something deep inside him had finally snapped. And to the staff watching from the control room, it looked exactly like the beginning of something dangerous, something they had been trained to prevent at all costs. "He's agitated again," Ethan Cole muttered under his breath, leaning closer to the monitor, his fingers hovering over the emergency lockdown switch, because Marcus wasn't supposed to behave like this. Not anymore. Not after years of silence. Not after being labeled as withdrawn, unresponsive, a gorilla that had simply faded into the background of the facility's daily routine. But now, he was anything but invisible, his movements sharp, deliberate, his eyes fixed in a way that made the air feel heavier, tighter, like something unseen was building just beneath the surface. Across the enclosure, Luna remained still, her pale fur almost glowing under the dim overhead lights, her body curled in a way that made her look smaller than she was, fragile in a place that had never been gentle, and even from a distance, it was clear she was slipping, her breath shallow, spaced too far apart, the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful but final. "She's not going to make it through the night," Dr. Hannah Brooks had said earlier that morning, her voice calm but weighted with certainty. And since then, no one had argued, no one had tried to change the outcome, because sometimes, in places like this, nature took its course and all anyone could do was watch. But Marcus didn't seem to accept that. Not today, not anymore. Because every few seconds he would stop, turn his head slightly, and stare straight toward Luna's enclosure, as if he could sense something the humans couldn't, something pulling him closer, something urgent and impossible to explain. "Why is he looking over there?" One of the younger staff members whispered, her voice barely audible, but no one answered, because no one had an answer. Only a growing tension that crept into every corner of the room as Marcus suddenly let out a low, rumbling sound. Not loud, not aggressive, but deep, almost like a call. And then he moved again, faster this time, striking the barrier with both hands in a desperate rhythm that didn't look like anger, didn't look like fear, but something else entirely, something that made Ethan hesitate, his finger no longer hovering but frozen, because for the first time, it didn't feel like Marcus was trying to break out. It felt like he was trying to get somewhere, and the only question left hanging in the air, thick and unanswered, was why now, after all this time, after all that silence, would a forgotten gorilla suddenly refuse to stay away from one that everyone else had already given up on? 5 days earlier, the enclosure had been quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural, the kind of silence that made even the smallest sound stand out. And Luna had already begun to withdraw long before anyone officially noticed. Sitting in the far corner of her space with her back turned to the open area, her pale fur catching the morning light, but her body completely still, as if she had chosen a place and decided not to leave it again. At first, the staff assumed it was just another phase, something temporary, because Luna had always been different, more sensitive, more isolated, and being an albino had made her harder to integrate with the others. But as the hours turned into days, her behavior stopped looking like preference and started looking like something deeper, something heavier, because she was no longer eating the food left for her, no longer responding to voices, and no longer lifting her head when someone approached. And that was when Dr. Hannah Brooks began her regular checks, kneeling just outside the enclosure, speaking softly, trying to coax even the smallest reaction. But Luna remained distant, her breathing slow and uneven, her eyes half closed as if the world around her had already begun to fade. Ethan had watched it all unfold from a distance at first, telling himself that animals sometimes needed space, that forcing interaction could make things worse. But by the second day, even he could not ignore the change, because Luna, who once moved cautiously but steadily through her environment, had now reduced herself to almost nothing, a quiet presence that seemed to shrink with every passing hour. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the facility, Marcus had remained exactly as he always had, sitting alone in his enclosure, his large frame still and composed, rarely interacting with anyone or anything, the staff barely paying attention to him anymore, because there was nothing to report, nothing to fix, nothing that demanded urgency, and that was exactly why no one noticed the first time he paused longer than usual, turning his head slightly toward the distant corridor where Luna's enclosure was located, his gaze lingering for just a moment before returning to stillness. The next day, it happened again. Only this time he stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked to the edge of his enclosure, gripping the barrier as he looked out, his eyes scanning as if searching for something he could not quite see, and one of the staff members passing by made a brief note of it, marking it as minor restlessness, nothing unusual, nothing worth escalating, because Marcus had never shown signs of aggression, never caused concern, and certainly never demanded attention. But what no one realized was that his behavior was beginning to change in ways too subtle to trigger alarms, because each time Luna grew weaker, Marcus seemed to grow more alert, more focused, as if some invisible connection was pulling his awareness toward her, and by the third day, when Luna had stopped moving entirely for several hours at a time, Marcus no longer stayed seated, instead pacing slowly within his space, his movements controlled but persistent, his eyes no longer empty but fixed with a purpose that no one could explain. "He is just reacting to environmental stress," one of the junior staff suggested during a routine check, and Ethan nodded, because that explanation was easier, safer, something that fit within the boundaries of what they understood. But even as he agreed, he could not ignore the uneasy feeling building in his chest, because there was something about the timing that did not make sense. Something about the way Marcus always seemed to move when Luna grew. Stiller, quieter, closer to disappearing. And yet no one connected the two. Not yet, because to them, these were separate enclosures, separate animals, separate stories, and the idea that one could be responding to the silent suffering of another had not even crossed their minds. But it was already happening, slowly, quietly, building towards something none of them were prepared to witness. By the fourth day, the tension inside the facility had shifted from quiet concern to something far more urgent, something that could no longer be explained away with routine observations or simple notes in a daily log. Because Luna had not changed position in nearly 12 hours, her body still curled into itself, her breathing so faint that Ethan had to stand completely still just to confirm it was still there, and even then, it felt like it could disappear at any moment. Dr. Hannah Brooks had already increased her visits, checking Luna every few hours, her movements careful and deliberate as she monitored signs that were becoming harder and harder to read, and each time she stepped away, her expression grew heavier, more resigned, as if she was slowly accepting a conclusion she did not want to say out loud. "She is shutting down," she finally admitted quietly, her voice steady but unmistakably weighted, and Ethan nodded without responding, because there was nothing to argue against, nothing to fix, only time passing in a direction no one could reverse, across the facility. However, something entirely different was unfolding, something that did not match the stillness surrounding Luna. Because Marcus was no longer pacing slowly or pausing occasionally, he was moving with a consistency that had never been recorded before, walking from one end of his enclosure to the other in measured steps, stopping only to stare toward the corridor again, his focus unwavering, his body tense in a way that did not resemble fear or confusion, but something closer to determination. "He has not rested all morning," one of the staff members reported, glancing at the monitor with a hint of unease, and this time, Ethan did not dismiss it, because he had noticed it too, the way Marcus would freeze mid-step, his head tilting slightly as if listening for something beyond the reach of human hearing, something distant yet unmistakable to him. The behavior grew more intense as the hours passed, and by midday, Marcus began making low, rhythmic sounds, not loud enough to alarm but steady enough to draw attention. Sounds that seemed almost deliberate, almost directed, and when the younger staff member suggested it might be agitation, Ethan hesitated before agreeing, because deep down, it did not feel like agitation, it felt like communication, even though that idea made no sense within the structure they relied on to understand the animals and their care. Increase monitoring, he finally instructed, his tone calm but firm, and the cameras adjusted slightly, focusing more closely on Marcus, capturing every movement, every pause, every glance toward the distant enclosure where Luna remained completely still. As the afternoon stretched on, something changed again, something subtle but undeniable, because Marcus stopped pacing entirely and moved to the barrier, gripping it firmly as he leaned forward, his eyes locked in the same direction, his entire body aligned with a purpose that no one could explain, and for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of uncertainty that he could not ignore, because the pattern was becoming too clear, too precise, as if Marcus was responding to something happening in real time, something connected to Luna in a way that defied everything they believed about separation, distance, and awareness. "This does not make sense," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, but no one challenged it, because they could all see it now, the shift, the focus, the growing intensity that did not fit any known behavior they had studied or recorded, and yet it was happening right in front of them, building moment by moment towards something that felt inevitable, even if no one could name what that something was. Back in Luna's enclosure, the stillness remained unbroken, her body unmoving, her presence fading into the background of the space she once occupied, and for a brief moment, the room felt suspended between two completely different realities, one where everything was slowing down, and one where something was accelerating, something that was no longer subtle, no longer ignorable. And as Marcus suddenly tightened his grip on the barrier and released a deeper, more urgent sound than before, every person watching felt the same unspoken realization settle in at once, that whatever was about to happen next was not random, was not coincidence, and was definitely not something they were prepared to stop. The room grew quieter, but not in a calm way. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone is waiting for something to go wrong, and Ethan could feel it pressing down on him as he stared at the monitors, replaying the same sequence in his mind over and over, trying to make sense of a pattern that should not exist, because everything about the situation suggested two completely separate realities. Yet Marcus kept reacting as if they were one and the same. "We cannot ignore this anymore," Dr. Hannah Brooks said firmly as she stepped closer to the control panel, her eyes moving between the live feeds, one showing Luna's motionless form and the other locked on Marcus, who had not stepped away from the barrier for nearly 15 minutes, his entire posture fixed forward, his muscles tense but controlled, as if he was waiting for something only he could perceive. Ethan exhaled slowly, weighing his options. Because the rules were clear, the enclosures were designed to keep the animals separate for a reason, especially in cases involving weakened individuals, and Luna was as vulnerable as she could possibly be, barely responsive, barely holding on, and the last thing anyone would normally consider was introducing another gorilla into that space, especially one behaving unpredictably. "He is escalating," one of the staff members said, pointing to the screen as Marcus suddenly shifted his stance and struck the barrier again, not wildly, not out of control, but with a precision that felt intentional, almost like a signal, and this time the sound carried differently, sharper, more urgent, causing everyone in the room to flinch slightly as it echoed down the corridor. "He is going to hurt himself if this continues," the same staff member added. And that was the moment the narrative in the room began to solidify, because from a human perspective, Marcus's behavior fit the pattern of distress, agitation, a potential risk that needed to be contained before it turned into something worse. And once that assumption took hold, every action he made started to look like confirmation of it. "We need to isolate him further," another voice suggested, and for a brief second, Ethan almost agreed, because it was the safest choice, the most logical response within the system they trusted. But something stopped him, something small and persistent that did not align with the idea of Marcus being out of control, because nothing about his movements felt random, nothing about his focus felt scattered, and the way he kept looking in one direction, unwavering, deliberate, did not match panic, it matched purpose. "Wait," Ethan said quietly, his voice cutting through the rising tension just enough to pause the conversation, and all eyes turned toward him as he leaned closer to the monitor, studying Marcus more carefully, watching the subtle details that others had dismissed, the slight pauses between movements, the way his breathing slowed whenever he faced Luna's enclosure, the way his grip tightened not when he was moving, but when he was still, as if holding himself back. "Does that look like aggression to you?" Ethan asked, not expecting an immediate answer, and for a moment, no one spoke, because the question forced them to reconsider what they were seeing, to look past the noise and the movement and focus on the intent behind it. And that was when doubt began to replace certainty, slowly but unmistakably. Dr. Hannah crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing as she observed the same details, and after a few seconds, she shook her head slightly. "No, it does not," she admitted, her voice quieter now, more cautious, because if it was not aggression, then the only alternative was something far more complicated, something that did not fit neatly into their protocols. Back on the screen, Marcus leaned forward again, releasing another low sound, deeper this time, and as it echoed faintly through the facility, something unexpected happened, something so subtle that it could have been missed if no one had been watching closely. Because for just a fraction of a second, Luna's fingers twitched, barely noticeable, almost imperceptible, but enough to freeze the entire room in place. Every person staring at the monitor as the realization settled in, slow and heavy, that this was not random behavior. This was not stress, and whatever Marcus was doing, it was reaching her. For a moment, no one in the room moved, no one spoke, because what they had just seen did not fit into anything they understood. It was too small to prove anything and yet too precise to ignore, and Ethan felt a sudden shift in his chest, a quiet but undeniable realization that this situation was no longer about managing behavior. It was about understanding something they had completely missed. "Did you see that?" The younger staff member whispered, her voice barely steady, and Dr. Hannah nodded slowly, her eyes still locked on the screen. "Yes," she responded. She said, choosing her words carefully, as if saying them too loudly might somehow break whatever fragile connection had just formed. On the monitor, Marcus had gone completely still again, his massive frame no longer pressing against the barrier, his breathing slower now, more controlled, as if he was waiting for something, listening for something, and then he made that sound again, low and steady, a deep vibration that seemed to travel through the space rather than simply echo within it. Ethan leaned closer, his focus narrowing, because this time he was not looking for signs of distress. He was looking for patterns, for cause and effect, for anything that could explain what they were witnessing. And when Luna's fingers moved again, slightly more this time, a faint curl and release, it was enough to erase any doubt that had been left in the room. "This is not random," Ethan said, his voice firmer now, more certain, and no one disagreed, because the evidence was unfolding in front of them, subtle but consistent, undeniable in its timing, and for the first time, the idea that Marcus was reacting to Luna shifted into something much more specific, something much more intentional. "He is trying to reach her," Dr. Hannah said quietly, her eyes softening in a way that had not happened all day, and the words hung in the air, heavy with implication, because if that was true, then everything they had assumed about Marcus's behavior was wrong, completely wrong. But how? Someone asked, and it was a fair question, because there was no direct line between the enclosures, no shared space, no physical interaction, only distance and barriers and systems designed to keep them apart. And yet somehow, Marcus was affecting Luna in a way none of them could explain. Ethan ran a hand across his face, thinking quickly, because the situation was changing faster than their protocols could adapt, and for the first time, he found himself considering an option that had not been on the table before, something risky, something that would normally be dismissed immediately, but now felt impossible to ignore. "If he is the only one getting a response," he began, his voice trailing off as the weight of the idea settled in, and Dr. Hannah turned to look at him, her expression sharpening as she understood exactly where his thoughts were going. "You are not suggesting we bring him closer," she said, not as a question but as a challenge, because the risk was obvious, the potential consequences too great to overlook, and yet neither of them dismissed it outright. Not after what they had just seen. Ethan hesitated, not because he doubted the connection, but because he understood the responsibility that came with acting on it, and for a few seconds, the room held its breath again, suspended between caution and possibility. On the screen, Marcus shifted slightly, releasing another low sound, and Luna's hand moved once more, a small but unmistakable response that made the decision feel less like a gamble and more like something they could not afford to ignore. Ethan straightened, his voice steady now. "Prepare for controlled proximity," he said, and immediately the room came back to life. Staff moving into action, procedures being discussed, safety measures outlined. But beneath all of it was a shared understanding that they were stepping into something unknown, something that went beyond training and protocol, because whatever Marcus was doing, whatever connection he had found, it was reaching Luna in a way nothing else had, and now they had to decide if they were willing to trust it. The decision moved faster than anyone expected, not because they were confident, but because waiting no longer felt like a safe option, and within minutes the team had shifted from observation to action, their voices low but urgent as they coordinated each step with precision, ensuring that every possible safeguard was in place. Because even now, even with what they had seen, there was still risk, still uncertainty, and no one could fully predict what would happen once the distance between the two enclosures was reduced. Ethan stood at the control panel, his eyes moving between the live feeds and the team preparing the transition corridor, a narrow passage designed for controlled animal movement, rarely used and never under these circumstances. And as he watched Marcus on the screen, he noticed something that made his grip tighten slightly, because Marcus was no longer striking the barrier or pacing with restless energy. He was waiting, completely still, his body angled toward the direction of Luna's enclosure as if he already knew something was about to change. "He senses it," Dr. Hannah said quietly beside him, her voice no longer filled with doubt, but with a cautious recognition of what they were witnessing, and Ethan nodded, because the timing was too precise to dismiss, too aligned with their actions to be coincidence. As the outer gate to Marcus's enclosure slowly unlocked with a soft mechanical click, the room seemed to hold its breath again, every movement becoming deliberate, every second stretching longer than it should, and for a brief moment, nothing happened. Marcus remained still, his eyes focused forward, his posture unchanged, and then, without hesitation, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the corridor with a calmness that sent a ripple of unease through everyone watching, because there was no aggression, no confusion, only direction. Maintain visual contact, Ethan instructed, his voice steady but firm, and the cameras adjusted as Marcus moved through the passage, his pace controlled, neither rushed nor hesitant, as if he had already decided where he needed to go long before the path had been opened. Back in Luna's enclosure, there was still no visible movement at first. Her body remained curled, her breathing faint, but as Marcus approached the adjoining gate, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, her fingers twitching once more, slightly stronger than before, a small signal that did not go unnoticed this time. "She is responding again," one of the staff members said, his voice edged with disbelief, and Dr. Hannah stepped closer to the screen, her eyes narrowing as she watched carefully, because this was no longer a possibility, it was a pattern, and it was happening in real time. The final barrier between the two enclosures remained closed, a reinforced gate designed to prevent direct contact, and Ethan hesitated for just a second, his hand hovering over the release control, because this was the point of no return, the moment where observation would become intervention, where they would either confirm what they believed or face consequences they could not fully anticipate. "We keep the safety divide in place," Dr. Hannah said quickly, reading his hesitation, and he nodded in agreement, because they were not abandoning caution. They were adjusting it, adapting it to something new. As the inner gate slid open, allowing Marcus to enter the adjoining space just outside Luna's enclosure, he stopped again, standing only a few feet away from where she lay, separated by a transparent barrier, and for the first time, he lowered his head slightly, releasing a deep, steady sound that resonated through the enclosure in a way that felt different from before, more focused, more intentional. And as the sound settled into the space, Luna's hand moved again, this time lifting just slightly off the ground before falling back, a fragile motion, but unmistakably stronger than anything they had seen in days. And in that moment, every person watching understood that they were no longer witnessing coincidence. They were witnessing connection, something raw, something instinctive, something that did not need explanation to be real. And as Marcus remained there, unmoving, his presence steady and unwavering, the only question left was not whether this was working, but how far they were willing to go to follow it. No one spoke as the seconds stretched out, because what they were seeing was unfolding too precisely, too quietly, like something that demanded silence in order to exist, and Marcus did not move away from the barrier, did not rush forward or pull back. He simply stayed there, his large frame lowered slightly, his breathing steady as he released another deep, controlled sound that seemed to settle into the space around Luna rather than bounce off it. And for the first time since he had entered the adjoining area, it no longer looked like he was trying to reach her. It looked like he already had. Her hand moved again. The younger staff member whispered, her voice barely containing the disbelief, and Ethan leaned in closer, his eyes locked on the screen as Luna's fingers shifted once more, slower this time, but more deliberate, a faint curling motion that seemed to respond directly to the rhythm of Marcus's presence. Dr. Hannah stepped forward, her posture changing, no longer cautious. In the same way but focused, intent, as she studied every detail, because this was no longer about a single reaction. This was progression, something building, something growing stronger with each passing moment. Marcus adjusted his position slightly, lowering himself further until he was almost seated, his body angled toward Luna in a way that felt protective, even through the barrier, and then he extended one hand slowly, not touching the surface but holding it just inches away, his fingers relaxed, open, as if offering something invisible yet meaningful. And when he released another low sound, softer this time, almost like a quiet call, Luna responded in a way that made the entire room freeze again, her arm shifting slightly, her hand lifting just enough to break contact with the ground before settling back down. The motion small but undeniable, a clear sign that something inside her was still listening, still present. This is not just stimulation, Dr. Hannah said under her breath, her voice filled with a kind of quiet awe that replaced the clinical distance she had maintained earlier, because this was something else entirely, something that did not belong to charts or protocols, something that felt instinctive and deeply personal, even across the divide. Ethan nodded slowly, his earlier hesitation replaced with a growing certainty that they had crossed into unfamiliar territory, but not in a way that felt wrong. Instead, it felt like they were finally seeing something that had been there all along, something they had simply not understood. Marcus remained still again, his eyes fixed on Luna, his presence unwavering, and after a few seconds, he repeated the same sequence, a soft sound, a slight forward lean, a pause, and once again Luna responded, this time with a faint shift in her shoulders, a subtle adjustment that suggested more than reflex, something closer to effort, something that required energy she had not shown in days. She is trying, Ethan said quietly, almost to himself, and no one corrected him, because that was exactly what it looked like, not a passive reaction, but an attempt, however small, to move, to respond, to stay. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely, the earlier tension replaced with something fragile but unmistakably hopeful. And even though no one said it out loud, they were all thinking the same thing, that Marcus was not just present, he was guiding her, pulling her back in a way they could not replicate, could not measure, but could clearly see. Minutes passed, each one marked by the same pattern, Marcus steady, Luna responding in small but growing ways. And with each repetition, the connection between them became harder to deny, harder to question, until it no longer felt like an experiment or a risk. It felt like the only thing that had worked, the only thing that was working. And as Marcus remained there, patient and focused, the realization settled over everyone watching that this was not an accident, not a coincidence, but something intentional, something deeply rooted, and whatever it was, bringing Luna back. The change did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, almost carefully, as if whatever force was holding Luna in place was loosening its grip piece by piece. And with every passing minute, the signs became harder to ignore, because what had started as small, fragile movements began to take on a new quality, something more intentional, more sustained, and Marcus did not break his rhythm. He remained exactly where he was, his presence steady and unwavering, his low, measured sounds continuing at intervals that now felt purposeful, almost like a pattern designed to guide rather than simply reach. Ethan could feel it in the room, the shift from disbelief to something deeper, something more emotional. Because this was no longer about whether Luna would respond. She already was. The question now was how far she could go, how much strength she could regain, and whether this connection could carry her beyond the edge they had all believed she was already crossing. Her breathing is changing, Dr. Hannah said, her voice focused but softer now, and as everyone leaned in closer, it became clear that Luna's chest was rising more consistently, not strong, not steady yet, but different, less fragile than before, and when her head moved slightly, just enough to shift her position against the floor, a quiet gasp moved through the room, because that was something they had not seen in days. Marcus responded immediately, not with sudden movement, but with a subtle adjustment, leaning forward just a fraction more, his hand still hovering near the barrier, his eyes fixed on her as if he could sense every change, every effort she made. And when he released another low sound, it carried a softer tone this time, less urgent, more grounding, like a reassurance that did not need to be understood to be felt. Luna's fingers moved again, this time curling more fully before slowly extending, her arm shifting just enough to pull slightly closer to her body. And although the movement was small, it carried weight, it carried intention, and for the first time, it looked like she was not just reacting, she was trying to come back. She is coming out of it, Ethan said quietly, his voice no longer uncertain, and Dr. Hannah nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen, because what they were witnessing was something no protocol had prepared them for, something that did not rely on intervention or treatment in the way they had always understood it, but on presence, on connection, on something that existed beyond their control. Minutes turned into more time, and with each passing moment, Luna's movements grew slightly more consistent, her breathing steadier, her body less rigid, and Marcus never stepped away, never broke focus, his patience unwavering as if he understood that this was not something to rush, not something to force, but something that needed time and presence above all else. At one point, Luna's head lifted just enough to break contact with the ground for a brief second before settling back down, and even though it was not a full recovery, not even close, it was enough to change everything, because it proved that she was still there, still fighting in her own way, still responding to something that only Marcus seemed able to provide. The atmosphere in the room softened completely, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet, almost reverent focus, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something rare, something deeply meaningful, and no one wanted to disrupt it. Marcus remained still again, his breathing calm, his posture relaxed but attentive, and as Luna's hand shifted once more, this time resting closer to her chest, the realization settled in fully that this was not just survival, this was connection bringing her back, and as long as Marcus stayed, as long as he continued what he was doing, there was now something that had not existed before, something fragile but powerful, something that felt like hope. By the time the evening lights dimmed across the facility, no one had stepped away from the monitors, not even for a moment, because what was happening inside that enclosure had quietly rewritten everything they thought they understood, and Luna was no longer the same still figure they had feared losing, her breathing now steady enough to follow without effort, her movements small but consistent, each one carrying a little more strength than the last, and Marcus remained exactly where he had been for hours, his presence unwavering, his patience unmatched, as if time itself did not matter as long as he stayed by her side. Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaustion settling into his shoulders, but his eyes never left the screen, because even now, he could not fully believe what he was witnessing, not because it was impossible, but because it was something they had overlooked for far too long, something that had been there all along without being recognized. "She is stable," Dr. Hannah said softly, her voice carrying a quiet sense of relief that had replaced the earlier tension, and for the first time that day, it did not sound like a temporary observation. It sounded like something real, something that might last. Luna shifted again, this time lifting her head slightly and holding it there for a second longer than before, her pale eyes opening just enough to take in a small part of the world around her. And although her gaze was unfocused, there was awareness there now, a faint but unmistakable return of presence that had been missing for days. Marcus responded in the same way he always had, not with excitement or sudden movement, but with quiet steadiness, releasing a low, gentle sound that seemed less like a call now and more like reassurance, as if confirming that she was not alone, not anymore. The room remained silent as everyone watched, because no one wanted to interrupt the moment. No one wanted to break whatever fragile connection had carried Luna back from the edge, and even the smallest movements now felt significant. Each breath, each shift, each response marking a step away from where she had been. Hours earlier, Marcus had been considered a problem, a forgotten animal showing signs of distress. But now it was impossible to see him that way, because everything he had done, every movement, every sound, had led to this moment, a moment where Luna was no longer fading, but returning. "We almost missed this," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. And Dr. Hannah nodded beside him, her expression thoughtful, because it was true. They had been ready to accept an outcome without fully understanding what was happening just beyond their perception. Marcus finally shifted his position slightly, not moving away, but relaxing just enough to sit more comfortably, his eyes still on Luna, his presence still anchored in place. And as Luna adjusted her arm once more, bringing it closer to her body with a movement that carried clear intention, it became undeniable that something had changed, something that could not be explained by routine care or standard intervention. The realization settled over the room slowly but deeply, that connection, even without touch, even without direct interaction, could reach further than they had ever allowed themselves to believe, and that sometimes, the ones they overlook, the ones they forget, are the ones who understand the most. Marcus did not seek attention, did not demand recognition. He simply stayed, and in doing so, he became the reason